So, in the evenings, we're visiting different beaches. And last night, we were principally at the beach by the river of Babylon. And I was reflecting on how that story of how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land reflected a bit on my own experiences from the beach at Waikanae in New Zealand. And there was 3 points last night. The first point was about the sovereignty of God, that God is in control of all that happens on the way through life. The second point was about engagement in society, that they were to engage in Babylonian society without becoming Babylonian, because they were to bear in mind that future hope that was intrinsic to their identity. And the third point was that in the exile, they were actually going to become more like the people of God were meant to be. They were going to have a greater hunger and thirst to seek after God at the end of the exile than they had at the beginning. So something quite surprising was going to happen. You would expect that after 70 years in captivity, the people of God would lose their distinctiveness. But in fact, at the end of that 70 years in captivity, God has used those experiences to sharpen their distinctiveness, to make them more like Him. So tonight, we're going to think a little bit more about how we share the good news and how we share the gospel with the people around us. How the distinctiveness of our lives and the things that we say together communicate the good news of Jesus to those around us. I was at an IFES conference once, and the guy was doing a seminar on how to do evangelism. So I went along because I'm always quite interested in what people have to say about how to share your faith effectively. So he started off and he said, what I like to do is I have a BMW, and I like to pick up hitchhikers in my BMW. He was Dutch. He said, so I slow down and I let the hitchhiker into my car, and then I start chatting to them. And after a few moments, I accelerate. And when I have kind of, going quite quickly, I swerve over onto the other side of the road, and I turn to the person next to me and I say, are you ready to meet your maker? He said it really makes them think. I don't think he quite worked out what it made them think. It made me think, I'm sorry I got into the car with this psycho. And my answer to are you ready to meet your maker is, are you ready to meet my lawyer? Because this isn't going to work out well for us. But I guess it was out of a desire to kind of get to the heart of the matter, to get to the crux of the gospel. It's about life and death, and we can settle it one way or another on the wrong side of the road in the next 5 minutes. So what you would say is at the heart of the gospel message. If you were to give a little outline explaining what the gospel is, what the good news of Jesus is. We used to interview people to work with the student ministry in the UK, and one of the things that they did as part of the interview process was you were asked to give a 5-minute gospel presentation, as if you were doing it to students. And some of them were great, some of them were worthy, uninspiring and tedious. The 2 that stick in my mind the most are somebody who brought a puppet and used the puppet to communicate, which was quite good until they expected me to start talking to the puppet. And that was just a step too far because of the context of the interview. That I thought I was interviewing them, but the puppet wound up interviewing me. And And then she kept touching my knee, and it all got a little bit, weird in there for a while. And the other one that sticks in my mind was somebody who just finished at Bible College in England, and they did a very polished presentation where they spoke for double the time allowed. They spoke for 10 minutes, and in their 10-minute explanation of what a Christian was, they didn't mention God, Jesus, the cross, the Holy Spirit, the Bible, sin, redemption, creation, glory, or anything that you would describe as a recognisable Christian symbol whatsoever. I wish I had filmed it. You know, it was breathtaking how it was possible to speak for that long without actually saying anything of substance. But I've been in quite a number of situations over the years where somebody has had a go at explaining the good news of Jesus, and listening to them, I've wondered what on earth they are talking about. So you get the "my life is a mess" gospel, which goes like this. My life is a mess. Your life is a mess. God knows that your life is a mess. Jesus came to fix up all the mess in your life. Come to Jesus and you won't be sad or unhappy or messed up anymore. Anybody heard a gospel presentation like that? What's wrong with it?
First person's still a mess.
Correct. There's not actually any good news there. What you found is some sympathy, possibly verging into empathy, but there's nothing that's actually fundamentally changing your life or your relationship with God or your eternal destiny. Or you get the kind of, following Jesus is the most fantastic thing that anyone can ever do. Jesus came that you might have life in all its fullness. I've never been happier following Jesus. If you come to Jesus, then you will be satisfied and fulfilled and successful, and you will not need to wonder what you have to do to make yourself attractive to women, because it will just shine out of you straight away, and you will be able to get the most attractive girl in the whole of the South Island. Who's heard a gospel presentation like that? It's the kind of prosperity gospel that our more sophisticated middle-class people buy into. Because we don't really expect God to give us money straight away, but He can give us success and happiness and quality of life and a nice girlfriend, then that's good enough to keep me getting on with, thanks very much. What's the problem with that?
Is there a guarantee He'll actually give you any of those things?
There's no guarantees, sure.
There's no kind of recognition of God's glory in a way?
Not in a way, absolutely no recognition of God's glory.
Jesus tells us that if we follow Him, we'll have persecution.
That doesn't sound a very popular sort of message, following Jesus with a persecution. How does that go down when you're sharing your faith, Sharon? Better keep that quiet until after they've made a commitment, and then bring in some of the small print later. So tonight we're going to go to another beach in Luke chapter 5 to look a little bit about what we can see from some of the early people who start to follow Jesus. So Luke chapter 5, reading from verse 1. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen, who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signalled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. So this takes place on the beach at Gennesaret. And when the narrative starts unfolding, when Luke starts the story of this day, this one day, at the start of chapter 5, you don't really get a clue about what's going to happen as the day unfolds, or as the morning unfolds. Because Jesus is standing there on the beach, and the people are crowding round, listening to the word of God being taught. So there is an issue with the crowd and Jesus' ability to communicate to them from where he is standing. So he chooses to go into a mobile pulpit. He chooses to get into a boat so that he can carry on teaching from the boat to talk to the crowd. And he chooses the boat belonging to Simon. Because on the beach there are some fishermen who have been out all night and haven't caught anything, and they are cleaning their nets in response to what has been a fruitless night of fishing. So even when you're out fishing and you haven't caught something, you have to clean your equipment so that it can be useful the next day, because it will pick up weed and algae and stuff. And having clean nets is important for catching fish, because if your nets aren't clean, the fish, although they've got very small brains, they've got quite big eyes and they can see the stuff that's on the net. Whereas if the net's clean, the fish kind of go, "Oh, that looks brilliant over there. Oh, it's a net," and they're caught. Okay. Anybody here really like fishing? Okay. I admire you for choosing something so low down the food chain to pit your wits against. I think that is awesome. Some of you probably use a rod, do you?
Yes.
See, nets, that's the way to go. Big nets in the water, catch lots of fish right away. Or better still, just go to the fishmonger or New World, and you can buy ones that have been previously outwitted by somebody who had access to more technology than you. You wouldn't necessarily have thought, if you'd watched Simon cleaning his net, that he was the one who was going to become the focus of attention. He's just an ordinary working guy going about his business. After a bit, he's out in the boat, basically sitting, listening to Jesus teaching. So Jesus has worked this through so that Simon is in the front row, listening to the teaching that's going on. He's not kind of been sat in the front row like the kind of naughty person on the step. He's there because it's his boat. It's kind of his dignity has been respected, but he's listening to what Jesus is saying to the crowd. And when he's finished speaking, when he's finished his talk to the crowd, Jesus turns to Simon and he says, "Put it into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon says, "Look, we've worked hard all night. We haven't caught anything." This isn't the time of day when you go fishing. You go fishing in the dark. You don't go fishing when the sunlight is on the water and the fish can see the big outline of the boat coming. But Simon says, because you say so, I will let down the nets. Now, if you just looked at Luke's gospel, you would imagine this is the first time that Jesus has met Simon. But we know from John's gospel that it's not the first time that they have met. So if you turn to John chapter 1, John chapter 1 verse 6, there was a man from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light, he came only as a witness to the light. And we hear that story of that man, John the Baptist, in chapter 1 from verse 19 following. And we discover that John has some disciples who are interested in what John is doing, and this work of spiritual renewal that's happening in the wilderness. And then one day, John, who is baptizing with water, Jesus comes into his environment, and in verse 29, John saws Jesus coming towards him and said, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And he talks about this being the one that he has been talking about, this being God's anointed one, this being the Messiah. Verse 35, the next day John was there again with two of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning round, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. It was about 4 p.m. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah, that is the Christ," and he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which translated is Peter. So we have John pointing people to Jesus, and one of the first people who realizes who Jesus is to some degree is Andrew, Peter's brother. And the first thing that Andrew does is goes and gets Peter to introduce him to Jesus. So that statement, "because you say so, I will," is actually undergirded by a bit of relationship, by a bit of history, where Andrew has taken Peter to meet Jesus. So when Jesus turns up on the shore and asks for a ride in the boat, Peter knows who it is. And when Jesus says, "Put out your nets for a catch," Peter says, "Well, it's a long shot, but because it's you, I'm willing to give it a go." So he started to recognize that there is something about Jesus which is different. He's beginning to understand there is something about Jesus which is to do with him being from God. It's something to do with God's promise and God's rescue. So going back to that first question about gospel outline, the absolutely primary thing we need to get our heads round is that the gospel is about Jesus. It's about God coming into the world. The centre of the gospel is not me, it is Jesus. It is God's initiative, God's rescue mission, which has been mounted. So when we bear testimony, we testify to Jesus. We testify about Jesus. There's something that was very influential in the 20th century, which is technically called the 19th century evangelical conversion paradigm, which really goes back to people like John Newton, who was a slave trader who became a Christian. And the contrast between being a slave trader and being a believer really demonstrated the change that God can make in people's lives. And you see it in the 20th century with people like Nicky Cruz, or people who've been involved in gangs or terrorism, and the difference that meeting Jesus makes to them. And you'll often hear somebody sharing their testimony where they almost apologise for not having been bad enough before they became a Christian. So like your ideal student testimony would be, I was in the Guides, and I was an arsonist. I used to burn down houses, and I was a bit of an axe murderer. Often of an evening, I'd be off round Ponsonby with my axe, taking people out. And then one night at the Guides, I was gloriously and wonderfully saved, and I've just not looked back since. Now, if that was your testimony, I'm not knocking that at all. It's tremendous that you've been saved from a life of arson and axe murdery, and that it happened through the Guides. That's great. The problem is, for everybody else who hasn't been burning things down or sharpening their axe and isn't in the Guides, it's a little bit far removed from their experience. So while it might be admirable, it's not particularly transferable. See the difference between talking about you and talking about Jesus? Because Jesus is relevant and real and alive to everybody. So sharing your testimony is sharing your relationship with Jesus, sharing your experience of Jesus, sharing the fact there's actually more of Jesus than you've got your head around yet. But from what you know, he's worth checking out. So in verse 6, they do what Jesus has suggested. And when they do so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. The disciples are never shown catching fish in the New Testament without Jesus' help. Must be slightly irritating when they kind of read the Gospels later. That at the point of their kind of greatest competence, Jesus is more competent. That this landlubber can actually teach the fishermen about catching fish. Because this isn't just an itinerant teacher. This is the Son of God. This is the one who knows the most about everything. Whatever you are studying, there is nothing that you are studying that would have Jesus scratching his head. Okay, I think I could have a reasonable fist at passing NCA, definitely level 1, probably level 2, and possibly level 3 at things like history, geography, and English. I would be hopeless at maths because I never understood what maths was about. I was good at arithmetic, got 94% in my arithmetic level 1, but when it became pure mathematics with things like cos and sine and tan and proofs and algebraic blah blah blah, I constantly asked the teacher, "What is the point of this, sir?" And he said, "It's mathematical." So it just went completely over my head. My parents paid for extra tuition for me. In my final high school prelim exams, I got 4 A's, which were all high A's, and in my maths I got 22%. The maths teacher was the first one who wrote on the report. All the other teachers didn't comment on what I got in their subject. My English teacher, 97%, comment, "Very disappointed to see Nigel's maths result at this level." Thanks a lot. So I would not be able to help my kids with maths. It's beyond me. There is nothing that is beyond Jesus. Even questions like, how can I be more attractive to girls? Might not get the answer you're looking for in the way that you're looking for, but Jesus understands that. And he certainly understands the frustration that you're experiencing when you feel you're not. And understands the propaganda you're feeding yourself when you believe that you are. Sees 3. And what's interesting is the response that Simon Peter has to this enormous catch of fish. Because the point of meeting Jesus isn't to make him a successful fisherman. The blessing, the prosperity of the fish is not what is at the heart of the message. So what Simon Peter doesn't say is, yeah, beauty, Jesus. We're going to go into business together. We're going to be the most successful fishing company the world has ever seen. Now, you're going to need to tone things down just a tad because the boats are sinking. But, you know, the general principle of you doing the fish spotting and me doing the net cleaning and the casting, we can really clean up here. You know, this is going to be excellent. Can I introduce you to James and John, their father Zebedee? They're a bit argumentative, but they're hard workers. I'm willing to bring them in at tier 2 as kind of associate business people in the thing. And we might even take Andrew. You know, he's a bit kind of prone to going off and doing religious things, but you know, despite that, he's my brother and he's all right. And I probably wouldn't have met him if you hadn't put us together. Not the response. The response is, get away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man. So Peter recognizes something new about himself because of something new that he has experienced with Jesus. He recognizes that he has encountered in some way the holiness of God. I think it's an absolutely fundamental principle that mission starts with the holiness of God. Starts with a fresh understanding of who God is, the otherness of God, the distinctiveness of God. You will never be able to motivate people in evangelism if your starting point is need. If you just say to people in your group, we need to be doing more outreach because these people need Jesus. And they do need Jesus. There is no question about that. But people will not be motivated and inspired to tell them about Jesus unless they know Jesus. Unless they have a fresh encounter with who Jesus is. Which is where a lot of evangelism training stuff falls flat on its face. Because in order to share the good news of Jesus, fundamentally, you don't need a technique. Fundamentally, you need to meet Jesus. Think of Isaiah, the year that King Uzziah dies, and Isaiah is in the temple. And the cherubim and the seraphim appear. And one of them takes a hot coal from the altar and flies with it to Isaiah's lips. And a coal from the altar should destroy Isaiah. But because it comes from the place of sacrifice and reconciliation, it brings healing. It brings a new realization. He sees the Lord high and lifted up. And he says, woe to me. I am a man of unclean lips, from a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the Lord. So when God says to him, who will go for us and who will I send? Isaiah goes, here am I, send me. That willingness to participate in the mission of God, coming from a fresh encounter with the character of God. So Simon Peter falls to his knees and says, "Get away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." Because they are astonished. They know that what they have seen with this massive catch of fish, you can't explain it. And it has to have something to do with Jesus. So Jesus says to Simon, "Don't be silly. You're not any worse than anybody else. That's a bit down on things, isn't it? Simple man. You're going to be one of the team." So he doesn't contradict him at all. Because he is a sinful man. But he's a sinful man who Jesus is committed to starting a new work in. We know in that previous encounter, he's already hinted at giving him a new name. That he's going to be the rock on whom the church is going to be built. But here at the end of chapter 5, he says, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So there's a reassurance comes. Yes, you're a sinful man. Yes, this is pretty big stuff. But don't be afraid. It's one of the things that Jesus says to the disciples at key points in the Gospels. After the resurrection, for example. Don't be afraid. Because when you meet God afresh, it's a scary thing. And the presence of God without the Word of God is an extremely scary thing. Because you don't know how to respond. You don't know what to expect. But here we have the presence of God with the Word of God. Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll fish for people. Don't be afraid. From now on, you're coming with me. That I am instigating a relationship with you. So they pull their boats up on shore, leave everything, and follow him. So their friends and family get the benefit of all these fish that have been caught. Massive kind of party, I would imagine, on the beach. McFish for everybody. So what we see here in Luke chapter 5 is a number of different things. We see that somebody starting to follow Jesus is something that Jesus does. When John talks about being born of the Spirit, becoming a Christian is something that God does to you. It's not just something you do to yourself. So we are not able to coerce people or manipulate people into genuine Christian experience and conversion, because it's something that God does. And if you try to manipulate or to change things or to mess things around, you will inevitably get it wrong. It's about partnering with what God is doing in people's lives. Remember, there was a guy started coming to our evening service at a church in Edinburgh, and I noticed him because he was on his own. So I thought, I'll try and chat to him at coffee, but when I got to coffee, he'd gone. So the next kind of 3 weeks, I kept missing him. So I started watching to see why I was missing him. And he was leaving during the last song, so he was gone. So one week, I kind of followed him when he went, and he was like a rabbit down a drain pipe, kind of through the car park and off into the sunset. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. He's actually trying to get away. So the next week, I kind of left before the start of the last song, so I was kind of between him and the car park on the way out, and we introduced ourselves. And I managed to get him to come for coffee, and it turned out that David was scared about two things. One was he didn't have a membership card, and he was worried if somebody asked to see his membership card, they would stop him coming to church. And the other thing was that he knew there was other churches nearer where he lived, and he tried some of them and didn't like them, and he was worried that if he was challenged and asked for his name and address, that the church police people or whatever would make him go to one of the other churches that he didn't like. So it was a kind of, he was trying to kind of investigate Jesus without kind of getting into trouble. And it turned out that David liked playing squash. Now, squash is my least favourite racket sport because I've always had better acceleration than deceleration. So, you know, tennis I was okay at, badminton I wasn't so good at, squash I'm really terrible at because I keep running into the wall. I can still beat my teenage kids at it, but that's because they're absolutely hopeless. But we agreed to start playing squash every week and do a Bible study after squash. I think he enjoyed the squash because he won every single week, and there was usually bruising and blood on my end of the equation. But we started doing a Bible study together over about 10 or 12 weeks, I suppose. And really all I was doing there was I was participating in something that God had already started to do in his life. You know, I was just spotting something of the grace of God and trying to work with that. And trying to work with that in a way that helped him to explore the scriptures for himself and which gave him a good feeling about his weekly squash game. But it was God that was at work there. And one of the things you need to think about is that God is at work in the lives of your family and your friends. And partly what you need to ask is that he will help you see where that is happening so that you can join in with that. There was a girl called Leisha who was at Victoria University a few years ago. And Leisha was a law student. She's back in Indonesia, married now, and working as a lawyer. And she would offer to read the gospel with international students. And word got round in the international student community that this girl would do this, that she actually had a queue of people waiting. They would come to her and say, people she hadn't met would come to her and say, could you read the gospel with me? And she would have to kind of say, yeah, I can do that, but you know, the next kind of opening comes up in such and such a time. She always had to have a booking system for people who wanted to read the gospel with her. That God is at work in the world. And it's God who brings people to himself. Second thing we notice from the story is that it's not always who you would expect who comes to Jesus. You know, when the disciples speak before the Sanhedrin at the start of Acts, and the Jewish leaders are astonished because these are ordinary people, but they've been with Jesus. That this isn't an elitist university kind of a thing that's going on here. This is somebody doing gateway. This is somebody who's working class, who's an honest, hard-working, probably a bit of a kind of brute of a guy who you might kind of worry about if you saw them coming. The only place I'm ever really slightly scared in New Zealand is in Auckland about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was walking down Queen Street, I think it was, and there was somebody coming towards me and I thought, oh, he looks a bit fierce and maybe a bit drunk. And I'm getting a bit scared. So I decided I would cross the road to get to the other side. And just before I crossed the road, he crossed the road to get away from me. So, slightly kind of intimidating. But we don't know who God is at work in the lives of. Often when I've done missions with students, I've got people to identify who they think is the person that is least likely to be interested in the Christian faith, and to write that person's name down and to pray for them and to pray for opportunities to speak to them. It is astonishing how often somebody's come up to say, that person that person that was never, ever, ever going to be interested, they are here. Because we can't make judgments about where people are at before God. And sometimes it's the people who are less likely, who aren't necessarily giving off the positive signals. Sometimes it's the people who get invited 3, 4 or 5 times before they actually come. And you see that in Simon Peter's story. You see his brother being enthusiastic. Then you see him meeting Jesus. You see him listening to Jesus teaching. And then you see this encounter around the fish. But that's just the start of this remarkable story, where Peter is going to put his foot in it more often than not in the next 3 years. And even after Jesus has been arrested, is not going to always make the smartest decisions. And even as a leader in the early church, isn't going to really understand everything that he should be doing. But Jesus has his eye on him and has chosen to work in and through him to bring glory to himself. So that's 3 things that we see from this story about the gospel. That it's God's story, it's God's gospel, it's about Jesus. And it's not just about Jesus. The whole business of people coming into relationship with him is Jesus' work. It's Jesus' business. And Peter and the disciples are going to be called into that business. You're going to fish for people. It's what Jesus has been doing in the boat. He's caught fish, but he's been fishing for people. The fish have been the bait, rather than the end result in itself. And we see that people who could be considered less likely are people who God can use to do many things, but who he can choose to bring to himself. You think of the thief on the cross. Today you'll be with me in paradise. It's what grace is about. That there isn't a kind of pecking order that makes you more likely to become a Christian because you went to the best schools and you were a prefect and you got NCE level 3 with excellence and you got a scholarship and you were in the top sports team and you've got blonde hair and you can grow a beard. It's not going to cut the mustard. God's grace, God's rescue mission starts in the heart of God and comes through Jesus to lost men and women, so that sinful people like you and I can become followers of Jesus. We had a talk the other day as the staff team, and the idea was raised with us that there are different kinds of young people. That there are kind of green young people who are kind of, basically kind of all right and happy in church, and there's kind of orange young people who've got a few kind of problems, but and then there's kind of red young people who are the kind of the basket cases who kind of might be doing alcohol and drugs and getting into trouble with the police. And I don't like anything that divides people up into a kind of hierarchy, because we are all sinful. We all fall short of God's standard. We all need the rescue of a Saviour. So we have to give to you tonight 2 copies of Luke's Gospel. Because the last thing that I want to say is really implicit in what I have been saying tonight, is that the Gospel has been given to us, and we have it in written form. that we don't have to invent it, it's there for us. So for every single one of you, we'd like to give you 2 copies of Luke's Gospel. This is the new Gospel that was produced just at the end of last year, and it was produced for the 200th anniversary of Marsden, but it's been produced in New Zealand to use in New Zealand. So it has some what's called a slice of heaven at the start and the end, where we have some New Zealand pictures. And then we have a font that has been used based on the work of Colin McMahon, who's a famous New Zealand artist. And there are pull-out quotes on the way through that kind of tell the story of the Gospel, if you just read the kind of pull-out quotes. And then there's some little helps in the margins in places as well. And some of that came from the 2 designers that we had working on the design of the Gospel. So we had 2 young Kiwi designers, one a young Pacific woman who's a Christian, and one who is a young Kiwi guy who I think would say he's an atheist. So it was quite interesting, the interplay between the atheist and the Christian, and what they thought should be featured and what they thought should be given for a bit of further explanation. So we have a challenge to go with these Gospels. It's called the 1+1 challenge. And what we would encourage you to do is to read one of these Gospels for yourself. Because one of the reasons that we find it difficult to remember that the heart of the Gospel is Jesus is it's not always what we're encountering in the preaching and the teaching that we're listening to. We can actually wind up becoming a bit cold in terms of our attitude to Jesus. So there's an encouragement to read one of the life story accounts of Jesus for yourself again. And to say, I want to have that joy of salvation. I want to be excited again about who you are, Jesus. Would you show me and remind me about how brilliant you are? And just warm my heart again to you, Jesus. And then the 1+1 is that the other Gospel that you have, while you're reading this Gospel, you think, who can I give the other Gospel to that I could invite to read it with me? So just like Andrew discovering more about Jesus and thinking, I need to get my brother, I'm going to get Peter, the encouragement is for each and every one of us as staff, graduates, student leaders to think about doing this term. You know, imagine if all of us read the Gospel and got excited about it and thought of somebody else that we could give it to and encouraged to read it with us. That would be us reaching 110 people with the good news of Jesus. 1+1. Quite exciting, eh? But probably something we might need a little bit of help thinking about how we could do that. So Mark Santich is going to come first of all and share a little bit about his experience in this and to help us think a little bit about how that might work out in practice.